Hey, high school literacy leaders, welcome back to Curriculum Chats. This is DLC Foster Yankee, and in this video, I'll be discussing the first two lessons in the second section of the Things Fall Apart unit. So we'll get started with Lesson 1. In this lesson, students will examine an interview for credibility and bias, including omission. They will evaluate details read in an interview to determine key details, analyze characteristics and structural elements of an interview, such as clear thesis, relevant supporting evidence, pertinent examples, and conclusion. There are two texts for this lesson, the novel and excerpts from An African Voice, which appears in the Atlantic. The materials for this lesson are the Things Fall Apart vocabulary list, vocabulary journal, annotating and note-taking reference guide, as well as the assessing resources reference guide. For the lesson overview, we will read an interview with Chinua Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart, in order to understand the writer's background, perspective, and purpose for writing the novel. There are 5 activities in this lesson. I should have edited that. I think 2 of them are optional. So this section begins with the teacher explaining the meaning of colonization. Students write the definition in their vocabulary journals and are directed to think about how colonization impacts the characters and culture as they read Things Fall Apart. The next activity is optional and has the class discussing the question, why is it important to assess the credibility and bias of a source? Students work in groups to conduct a web-based search for the publication The Atlantic and discuss the question, what kind of magazine is The Atlantic? Next, students read the concept, why assessing sources is important, and the process, assessing a source's usefulness in their assessing sources reference guide, and skim, guiding questions for assessing sources to get an idea of how to assess the credibility, accuracy, and bias of the article they are going to read. Next, they read and annotate An African Voice by Katie Bacon, respond to the questions about credibility and bias the teacher assigns to them or their group, and discuss the question, is this article, according to your research and analysis, reliable and relevant? Why or why not as a class? The teaching notes include some additional information about The Atlantic, including a list of notable authors who've been included in the publication. There are several questions for students to consider when assessing a source for credibility and bias. The teacher might want to only focus on assessing a source for credibility and have students discuss all or most of the questions for credibility, or the teacher might want to have students consider both credibility and bias and answer all or most of the questions for both. If they have difficulty with this assignment or if access to the internet is limited, students can work as a class instead of in groups. In Activity 3, students also read and annotate An African Voice by Katie Bacon and respond to the questions on the screen in their learning logs. What did Bacon learn from the popularity of the novel Things Fall Apart? What does Achebe call a miracle of literature? Why do you think he believes this? And according to Achebe, why has Nigeria fallen apart? Obviously, if students completed the optional activity prior to this one, they are rereading and annotating the text. If the teacher opted to skip that activity, students are reading and annotating the text for the first time. At this point in the school year, teachers and students should have a system they've been using to annotate the text. The teacher should ensure that the annotations students are being asked to write connect to the goals for the lesson and unit. To support student rereading, the teacher might have them use a text-specific question to complete either an analyzing relationships tool or an evaluating ideas tool. English learners can be encouraged to annotate the text in their home language. In Activity 4, students partner with a student from outside their group and share their answers from the previous activity. If they don't agree with their partner's answers, they talk it out to reach a consensus. This lesson concludes with an optional activity in which students review the terms on the vocabulary list for an African voice, adding words that are unfamiliar to them to their vocabulary journal, and writing down the words and definitions. I checked the list and didn't see any words for an African voice, but again, this activity is optional. So our cup for lesson 1 is students will know why Achebe thinks Nigeria, a lot of errors here. Nigeria has fallen apart. Understand Achebe's background, perspective, and purpose for writing Things Fall Apart, and be able to discuss answers to the questions. What did Bacon learn from the popularity of the novel Things Fall Apart? What does Achebe call a miracle of literature? Why do you think he believes this? And literally, the question from the K, according to Achebe, why has Nigeria fallen apart with a partner? Moving on to lesson 2. Students will analyze context to distinguish among denotative, connotative, and figurative meanings of words selected from the unit text. They will synthesize information from multiple texts to create new understanding and analyze the author's purpose, audience, and message within an article. The texts for this lesson are excerpts from An African Voice, Igbo Culture and History, and the Colonial Era. The materials for this lesson are the Attending to Details tool, Mentor Sentence Journal, Vocabulary and Context tool, Vocabulary Journal, and the Questioning Reference Guide. For the lesson overview, we will examine the British colonial influence on Nigeria by closely reading a text. We will extend our understanding of vocabulary, and there are 8 activities in this lesson, 2 of which are optional. So lesson 2 begins with students reading the colonial era, 1882 to 1960, and discussing the question on the screen with a partner. What do you notice about the text, and what questions do you have about the text? In the next activity, students determine the meaning of words and phrases in the text on the screen using their vocabulary journals and respond to the question on the screen, or the question that should be on the screen. How do you know when to use context clues and when to use another strategy to determine the meaning of an unknown word? This activity is all about students being able to decipher when context clues can and cannot be used, and which strategies to use when there is no context to define a word, which they will continue in subsequent activities in this lesson. Like this one. In activity 3, students continue working with context clues by determining the meaning of depose in the sentence on the screen from paragraph 4, which has enough context in the passage to determine its meaning. Yeah, right here. They discuss the question on the screen with a partner. What is happening in the sentence? Based on the context of the sentence, what does depose mean? Then students use the vocabulary and context tool to help them use context to determine the meaning of the list of words on the screen and add the words and their definitions to their vocabulary journals. The teaching notes suggest modeling how to use the vocabulary and context tool, since students will reference the guiding questions in the tool in later activities, but they've been using this tool since the beginning of the year, so that may not be necessary. So continuing with word work, in activity 4, students work with a partner to determine when to use context clues or another strategy to determine the meaning of the words listed on the screen. As they work, they discuss each word and the strategy they will use to determine the meaning and complete the tasks listed, which are here. Use context clues to determine the meaning of words that have enough context in the passage to provide the meaning. Use another strategy for the words that do not have context clues. The words are added to their vocabulary journals, and next to each one, they note whether they use context or another strategy to determine the meaning. In the next optional activity, students work with a partner, choosing 5 vocabulary words they've studied so far in the unit from Things Fall Apart and any other text they've studied. They contextualize the words using the process on the screen, which uses the word retain as an example. The activity concludes with students choosing one word and sharing the original context, a new context, and how they extended the context with the class. In this activity, students meaningfully interact with words, moving beyond mere definition and recognition to considering how the words are used in everyday situations. Identifying new context for vocabulary words increases the chances students embed the words in their working vocabulary and deepen their understanding of the word itself. Additionally, students reach back to Section 1 to reinforce vocabulary they've already been introduced to. Next, students use an attending to details tool as they reread the colonial era to determine the central idea and analyze how it is developed. The guiding question, what happened during the colonial era in Nigeria, is recorded in the guiding question space provided at the top of the document. Students read the text, paying attention to details that relate to the guiding question. Depending on how long the section of text is, they might find several examples. The attend to details row is used to write down the details that most strongly relate to the guiding question. Next, students make connections between the details they wrote down and the guiding question in the think about the details row. Then, in the express your understanding row, they write new connections, observations, ideas, or questions that result from reading and analyzing the text. At the end of the activity, the class discusses the questions: what is the central idea of the colonial era? And how does the author present the central idea? How does the author develop the central idea over the course of the text? To support students, the teacher might choose another guiding question from the questioning reference guide to model how a question can lead a reader to specific details in the text, walking through how to make meaning of or synthesize those details with respect to the question before having students practice this process with another guiding question or a text specific question. In the next optional activity, students think about the text that began this section of the unit and based on them, think about the central question. What does it mean for things to fall apart? In addition to the question, how might colonialism cause things to fall apart? This lesson concludes with students reading and annotating The Igbo People Meet the Europeans, the Era of Informal Empire, determining the central idea of this section of the text and responding to the question on the screen. How does this information support or challenge what you know about colonization? They also add new or interesting words they encounter in their vocabulary journal and at least two interesting sentences from the text to their mentor sentence journals. So, our cub for lesson 2 is students will know what happened during the colonial era in Nigeria. They'll understand how the author of the colonial era presents and develops the central idea over the course of the text and be able to determine the central idea of the colonial era using an attending to details tool. That's a wrap for this video. I welcome your feedback and look forward to hearing from you either on Twitter, via email, or in the comments. While you're here, don't forget to subscribe so you never have to worry about missing a video. Thanks for watching.